something unsettling is happening in London right now, and what most people are missing is not the allegation itself, but the machinery that makes an allegation feel like a verdict before a single fact is tested. And this isn't just another celebrity rumor cycle or tabloid flare-up destined to burn out by morning. It's actually a case study in how modern power, media grievance, and institutional ambiguity collide. And what we're watching is the slow conversion of uncertainty into narrative authority. So stay with me because the stakes here extend far beyond one person's reputation and into how truth is manufactured in public view. And as phones light up across newsrooms and group chats freeze mid-sentence and aides whisper about what can and cannot be repeated, the atmosphere tightens like a pressure chamber because a sealed filing, by definition unseen, has been transformed into a spectacle by assertion alone. And that transformation is where danger begins, because the moment a broadcaster frames access as proof and opacity as guilt, the public is nudged toward inference, not evidence. And that's why this matters. And the center of gravity here is not the claims circulating online, but the decision to elevate them through a megaphone, with Piers Morgan positioning himself as both messenger and validator while insisting the documents speak for themselves, even as no court has confirmed their existence. And when the name Meghan Markle is invoked, the room temperature drops, because this isn't about a surface scandal. It's about a figure onto whom years of cultural resentment, racialized suspicion, and media grievance have been projected, and that history primes audiences to accept insinuation as insight, because sealed filings are procedural tools, not truth machines, and exhibits are claims awaiting challenge. And yet the architecture of social media collapses that distinction in real time, rewarding confidence over caution and volume over verification. And behind closed doors, editors debate whether to link or to ignore. Lawyers flag defamation risk, and platforms watch engagement spike because outrage is liquid and liquidity attracts attention. And here's what few realize. The absence of confirmation doesn't slow the story, it accelerates it, because ambiguity invites participation, and participation creates a sense of collective discovery that feels democratic, even as it bypasses due process. And this is where the institutional backdrop matters, because Buckingham Palace has learned that silence can be misread as strategy, while any comment risks legitimizing the frame itself. And that tension leaves a vacuum others rush to fill. And the presence of Prince Harry in the narrative adds another layer, because prior testimony about media harm becomes context that is either weaponized or dismissed depending on the audience's prior beliefs. Because this isn't about whether claims are true or false yet, it's about how quickly systems allow unverified to masquerade as understood. And that's why this moment is historically significant. And as London's courts remain sealed and official channels remain quiet, the real story is how authority migrates from institutions to personalities in the attention economy. And this is where what's really happening begins to come into focus. And this is where the significance deepens, because once you move past the surface spectacle of screenshots and insinuation and into the mechanics of how this story traveled, a pattern snaps into focus that has repeated itself for more than a decade across British media culture. And because the materials in question are described as exhibits to a sealed High Court filing, legal experts are right to emphasize that sealed filings are containers, not conclusions, which means they often include untested assertions precisely because the court has not yet filtered them through adversarial scrutiny. And that distinction matters because when Piers Morgan says he has seen the evidence while the public cannot, he is not merely reporting, he is asking for trust. And he is leveraging a reputation built on conflict with the very subject of the claims to demand that trust. And what makes this revealing is not the allegation itself, but the asymmetry of access because viewers are told there is a record without being allowed to examine the record, which turns belief into a loyalty test rather than a reasoned judgment. Because this is not the first time allegations about Meghan Markle have followed this exact arc, where unnamed sources, partial documents, and claims of insider knowledge circulate long before any adjudication. And because each cycle ends not with correction, but with exhaustion, the reputational damage accumulates regardless of outcome. And here's what few realize. Repetition itself becomes evidence in the public mind, not because facts compound, but because familiarity feels like confirmation. And behind closed doors, media lawyers know this, which is why phrasing like questions are raised and documents suggest are deployed as shields, even as the narrative implication races ahead. And when Buckingham Palace declines to comment, that restraint is reframed as evasiveness, even though any intervention would almost certainly widen the blast radius by validating the premise that the claims deserve a response. Because institutions are slow by design and platforms are fast by incentive, the gap between them becomes a vulnerability that actors with personal or ideological grievances can exploit. And psychologically, this follows a familiar profile because Morgan has long treated disagreement not as difference, but as provocation. And that mindset rewards escalation, not resolution, especially when audience engagement spikes with each insinuation. And while critics publicly demand clarification about documents and provenance, privately many admit the truth is almost beside the point because the spectacle itself has already served its function by reinforcing existing camps. And this is where the deeper pattern emerges, because while the legal system insists on process, the media ecosystem prizes immediacy. And when immediacy wins, the presumption of innocence erodes quietly, not through a verdict, but through vibes. And the institutional impact is cumulative because every time sealed material is treated as settled fact, the credibility of courts as arbiters weakens and the authority of personalities strengthens. And that's why this matters. And this isn't about defending a public figure from scrutiny. It's about recognizing how scrutiny becomes punishment when it is detached from verification. But what makes this truly dangerous is what's happening next, as the normalization of this pattern lowers the threshold for the next allegation, and the next, and the next. And while the surface debate churns over screenshots and sealed filings, something darker is building beneath it, because the real escalation isn't about any single claim, but about the normalization of a media logic that treats accusation as content and ambiguity as fuel. And because this story now exists less in courtrooms than in algorithmic feedback loops, the incentives have flipped, which means restraint looks like weakness and amplification looks like relevance. And that inversion quietly rewards those most willing to blur the line between inquiry and insinuation. And this is where the facade cracks, because the institutions designed to arbitrate truth, courts, editors, regulators, move deliberately by necessity, while the platforms that now mediate public understanding move instantly by design. And when those timelines collide, the faster one wins. And what's truly alarming is how power shifts in that collision, because individuals with large followings can effectively pre-adjudicate disputes by framing them emotionally before any evidence is tested. And once that emotional frame hardens, later facts struggle to penetrate. And this is no longer about Meghan Markle as a person. It's about how certain figures become symbolic containers for grievance, resentment, and cultural anxiety, which means allegations stick not because they're proven, but because they feel narratively satisfying to an audience already primed to believe them. And behind the scenes, media organizations understand this risk, which is why many have held back. But that restraint itself becomes part of the story, recast by critics as cowardice or complicity, and that reframing pressures even cautious outlets to engage, lest silence be interpreted as bias. And this is where power dynamics tilt, because those willing to publish first define the terms of debate, and everyone else is forced to react within that frame. And when Piers Morgan insists that questions must be asked while selectively presenting material, he isn't just asking questions, he's setting the boundaries of acceptable suspicion, and that boundary setting is power. And because audiences conflate confidence with credibility, the absence of institutional confirmation is reinterpreted as proof of a cover-up rather than proof of due process. And this is where normalization becomes dangerous, because once people accept that sealed documents can be treated as settled truth, the next step is to treat rumors as records and records as verdicts. And the deeper problem is institutional stress, because when courts are bypassed in the court of public opinion, their eventual rulings land not as clarifications, but as disappointments to those already invested in a narrative. And history tells us this pattern doesn't stay confined to celebrity cases, because techniques pioneered in low-stakes environments migrate upward, shaping how political scandals, national security claims, and even election disputes are processed. And the cost of this will be measured not just in damaged reputations, but in eroded trust. Because when the public learns to expect revelation without verification, skepticism mutates into cynicism. And this is where the stakes widen, because a society that no longer distinguishes between allegation and adjudication becomes easier to manipulate, not harder. And that's why this moment matters. And because what looks like gossip infrastructure is actually governance infrastructure in miniature, the question becomes not whether this story is true, but what kind of information system we are training ourselves to accept as normal. And this is where the story ultimately lands, because what we are witnessing is not a simple dispute about documents or personalities, but a stress test of how democratic societies metabolize uncertainty under pressure. And because uncertainty is unavoidable while verification is slow, the choice point arrives before the facts do, forcing institutions and audiences alike to decide whether they will privilege process or performance. And this isn't about protecting a public figure from scrutiny. It's about protecting the boundary between allegation and adjudication. Because once that boundary dissolves, accountability becomes indistinguishable from spectacle. And history tells us this pattern is familiar because whenever new media channels outpace old safeguards, the first casualties are nuance and patience, followed closely by trust and behind the scenes. Regulators hesitate to intervene for fear of appearing partisan, editors fear missing the moment, courts fear being misinterpreted, and platforms fear losing engagement, which means no single actor feels empowered to slow the machine even as everyone recognizes the cost. And this is where responsibility shifts outward, while those who speak loudly model a confidence that feels like transparency even when it isn't. And this is where the deeper problem emerges, because confidence is contagious and caution is lonely. And systems built for deliberation struggle to compete with personalities optimized for immediacy. And the question is no longer whether any specific claim will be proven true or false. It's whether the public will accept a world where proof arrives too late to matter. And that's why this matters. And because democracies depend on shared standards for evidence, the erosion of those standards in celebrity culture foreshadows their erosion in civic life, where the stakes are higher and the consequences harder to reverse. And once you see how authority migrates from institutions to influencers during moments of ambiguity, you can unsee it. Because the same mechanics recur in debates over security, elections, and public health, and the cost of ignoring this will be paid not in one verdict, but in many small losses of confidence, until skepticism hardens into resignation. And this isn't a call for censorship or deference, it's a call for literacy, for the discipline to distinguish questions from conclusions and access from proof. And as this story continues without a ruling, without confirmation, and without closure, the real test is whether attention itself can be governed by principle rather than impulse. And the moment asks something uncomfortable of all of us: to slow down, to demand verification, and to recognize that the health of public truth depends less on who speaks loudest and more on who waits for evidence.